Welcome everyone, and a huge welcome to all the undergrad students joining us for this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to be your guide today. We're going to be unpacking some seriously foundational theories, the kinds of ideas that don't just dictate how we look at buildings, but actually shape how architectural practice and critique function at their very core. We are talking about the true architecture of thought. Let's get right into it.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to kick things off with autonomy and architectural form. Then we'll move into transgression in architecture. After that, we'll trace the evolution of aesthetics. And finally, wrap the whole thing up with contemporary aesthetic approaches.
Part 1. Autonomy and architectural form.
Okay, so first things first, what do we actually mean when we talk about autonomy in our field? Well, autonomy is basically the quest where form, and we're talking capital F form here, becomes the primary concept. It's the essential bridge connecting architecture to art. It's all about architecture searching for its own intrinsic qualities, separating itself from pure, strictly functional engineering by putting formal design above absolutely everything else. Think about cutting the strings of a puppet. That perfectly illustrates this idea of achieving a critical distance. By severing those ties, the discipline is finally free to produce knowledge entirely from within. And, maybe more importantly, it allows architecture to resist external authorities and outside pressures. Now, the roots of this idea go way, way back. Leon Battista Alberti actually gave us the very first theoretical statement on architectural autonomy all the way back in 1452. He argued that the real pleasure in architecture actually comes from its formal organization, its design. And it's exactly this autonomy that allows us to see how specific formal operations can establish a completely distinctive identity for any given form. It's fascinating to look at the bridge between the purely theoretical and the built reality. If you look at abstract axonometric diagrams analyzing formal rules, like those from Peter Eiserman, and compare them to the actual physical reality of something like a Palladian villa, it clicks. It perfectly shows how abstract, autonomous formal operations translate directly into concrete physical architectural identity. The rules literally generate the reality.
But wait a second, you might be wondering, does autonomy mean we just ignore a leaking roof or whether a building might, actually fall down? Thankfully, no. Autonomy does not just ignore practical concerns. Instead, it treats functional, social, and technological requirements as necessary evils. These are elements that just have to be tamed, compromised, or even exploited so that the designer can laser focus on the central problem, which is form.
And this brings us to a really fascinating paradox. There's a brilliant quote that says, "Autonomy aids architecture to pretend to be detached, while in reality it is engaged." I really want you to hold on to that thought, because focusing on form isn't about ignoring the world. It's actually a deeply engaged intellectual stance. It creates a highly specific lens through which architecture interacts with reality.
Part 2. Transgression in architecture. So what exactly do we mean by transgression? At its most basic root, it simply means to cross over. In architecture, this means crossing established borders, stepping completely outside standard disciplines, rethinking conventional practices, and even pushing back against professional legislation. Basically, for architecture to evolve, it has to occasionally break the established rules.
Imagine standing right on a painted stop line. That edge vividly represents the moment of decision. Transgression is all about operating beyond accepted norms. It's about radically reinterpreting our practice and pushing the boundaries of what architecture is, and more importantly, what it could or even should be. It's about having the guts to step over that line.
But there's a catch here. Transgression absolutely does not deny the principle of a limit. In fact, it completely relies on it. Think about it. Transgression can only really be defined in relation to a limit. And a limit isn't truly a limit unless it can be crossed. So what does this all mean? It means you have to deeply, intimately understand the traditions, rules, and history of architecture before you can effectively push past them.
The renowned architect and theorist Bernard Tschumi anchors this idea just perfectly for us. He states that there is no architecture without everyday life, movement, and action. When human societal shifts crash into stable institutions, those exact disjunctions force architecture to constantly redefine itself. We simply can't be constrained by tradition if we actually want our work to reflect a rapidly changing world.
When you conceptually blend a human subject directly into a structural framework, you're visually interrogating those very boundaries. And questioning them doesn't destroy the specificity of architecture. Far from it. Instead, transgression helps expose how architecture could be otherwise. It redefines its dynamic, messy relationships with other disciplines like art, sociology, or technology. Part 3. The evolution of aesthetics.
Let's map this out chronologically for a second. The root of the word is the ancient Greek aesthetikos, which just referred to raw sensory perception. But as a formal, recognized discipline, aesthetics actually wasn't born until the 18th century, with philosopher Alexander Baumgarten, before Immanuel Kant quickly came along and expanded it into this beautiful concept of the free play of imagination.
To really grasp how big of a shift this was, we have to look at the sharp contrast between two distinct philosophies. For classical thinkers, guys like Plato and Aristotle, art was just mimesis, basically just an imitation or representation of the real world. But Baumgarten completely flipped the script in the 18th century. He argued art is sensuous knowledge. It's not about just copying nature anymore. It's about the pure sensory perception of beauty.
And then Immanuel Kant steps in and adds a massive, pivotal layer to the theory. Kant defined aesthetics as the free play of imagination applied to artistic judgment. He essentially made the subjective human imagination central to how we evaluate and appreciate both art and nature. It was a game changer because it moved the power of judgment directly into the mind of the observer.
Ever since Kant, modern aesthetics has broadened significantly. It's no longer just some strict measurement of classical beauty. Today, it encompasses the evaluation of human experience, the assessment of formal properties, the analysis of cultural attitudes, and the overall measurement of pleasure and value. It has, for all intents and purposes, become the philosophy of art itself.
Part 4. Contemporary aesthetic approaches.
So where does that leave us today? Well, we generally divide our modern critique into two main camps. On one side, you have functionalism, which evaluates a work based on its success in providing a pleasurable aesthetic experience. It basically asks, does this feel good? Then, on the flip side, is proceduralism, or formalism, which defines art entirely by the rules, the knowledge, and the inner reflexive logic used by the creator. Consider a pot of water boiling on a radiator. That is pure functional usability, right? It heats the water, job done. Conversely, think about a high-end essential oil diffuser. That represents aesthetic usability. Yes, it performs a function, but its primary goal is generating a pleasurable sensory experience. Contemporary architecture is constantly, always, navigating this exact tension between the two.
Ultimately, the contemporary consensus basically argues that art, and by extension the absolute highest forms of architecture, is actually indefinable. Instead of trying to shove it into a neat little box, modern aesthetics focuses on how we recognize it. We do this by analyzing the incredibly complex formal, emotional, evaluative, and perceptual properties that make a space truly impactful.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a direct challenge for your own future studio practices. Armed with a new understanding of autonomy, the absolute necessity of limits, and the historical evolution of aesthetic judgment, what are you going to do? Will you design strictly within the safe, comfortable boundaries of tradition, or will you bravely transgress them to redefine what architecture could be? The choice, and frankly the future of our built environment, is entirely up to you. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.